Here's a tools list of what you're going to need to make your wood core. Now you don't have to use exactly the same tools I'm using, of course. Different things will suffice, you know. Got some saws here, but of course I'm going to use some power saws instead. It's a matter of what you've got and what you can work with. Here's what I've got. Of course the sword. Now you can actually do this without a sword as well. You just have to get some proper measurements from the tang of the sword you want to build a grip around. C-clamps, going to need that for gluing up some parts. There's one of the belt and disc sanders that I'll be using to shape it. Some good wood glue, something to measure things with. I use a few different things for different purposes. You know, calipers are good in a pinch for thickness measurement. A micrometer would be perfect, but we don't need to get that accurate anyway. You know, measuring tape, so the straight edge, pencil, do some markings with, of course. These, in this case, you see this old SEPA off an old SLO. I'm going to use as a template for the basic shape of the grip before I start to work it into its own design. You know, something of similar kind. I'm also going to myself be using some power saws. So here you see one saw sitting on top of another saw next to another saw. So in the case of a takedown hilt, what you want to start by doing is taking it apart. Already started that here. Let's just get that finished. Pull this off, and if you have the old grip, you have an advantage in that you can use it to measure its length. That's your starting point. You know, got a ruler, you got a ruler, right? That's calipers, you're going to do it that way. Get that thing measured up. If you need to, mark down what it's going to be, because this is what you're going to set the next piece of wood to length at. So there we go, 4.384. I like to take a couple of checks to see if I'm getting an overall number yet. So 4.383. All right, that's my start. I'm going to be taking my wood, marking that off here, and cutting 2 pieces of that. And for my second cut, it's as easy as doing that. The next thing that we're going to do is use a couple of these edges to create these strips that will go in the center of the core. Those strips will match the thickness of the tang, so we need to measure the thickness of the tang. So what I'm going to be doing is taking several measurements along this to make sure that I have an equal thickness all the way through. From what I've noticed from tangs, they tend to have the same thickness all the way down. At that point, there's no more, you know, distal taper when you get to the tang. There's no reason for that. In fact, you want to have a nice uniform thickness. Probably helps for the strength of the tang. So I'm just going to check some numbers here. Back here, we're looking at about 0.231. You know, over on this side, 0.226. Here, 0.240239. Now I got to be mindful of where the fuller is here, that I'm not measuring inside it. Looks like 0.209 at its narrowest, and I can see it does narrow a little bit at this point of the tang. So if anything, that's probably the number I'm going to end up shooting for the thickness of my wood. Yeah. I mean, we're talking decimal places of an inch here. Alright, so I've got my number, 0.2. You know, somewhere between 0.20 and 0.23. Now what I'm going to be doing is taking some thin strips off the edge of each of these blocks of wood that will end up on either side of this tang. So we'll do some measurements. What I like about a set of calipers is you have the depth measure on this end here. So set this to where you need it to be in several places across this edge. That gives me my reference point. for drawing my actual line. Okay. You got a ruler, use it instead, it'll all work. Good. And then again, take out my straight edge, and I'll be matching those up. A nice sharp pencil always helps. When I leave this on the edge, it's not, these edges won't be flush to the top and bottom of the handle because it's the exact same length, and then I'm angling it. I found that it's of such minimal difference that, it's not, it makes no difference when I'm finally making the grip, is what I've noticed. But if you prefer, you could do this part first, cut your strips to length. So what I mean by cut your strips to length, I should say cut your strips to length afterwards, is maybe take your other piece of wood and just take your measurements along it. Get your mark going on here. There you go. So the difference being here, when I cut this strip, if you can imagine, this piece is that strip of wood, and I put it on the wood, and there'll be another one here. It's going to be, as you can see, uneven on the edge here. It's going to move away from the very edge of the wood. If I were to be using a longer strip for that, it could overlap on each end and I could cut it flush. If all you have is a little bit of wood, this will work fine. It's no problem. It's such a minimal amount of size here. This is so narrow at that point, it's not going to make a huge difference. Right, so now I'm going to cut those strips off. In my case, again, I'm just using the short pieces for them. I find that once I overlap the leather when I wrap it, and with the narrow ends, it's minimal. Plus the fact that I left this just slightly longer than it needs to be by cutting on the outside of my lines gives me that room to play with that I need. Again, the key here is that you get a nice straight piece in your cut. Make sure you're paying attention to where the edge of the saw blade will come into contact with the wood. Make sure your saw is nice and straight. When in doubt, cut a little extra and sand it down. You have to be careful when you're doing that though, because you don't want to sand it unevenly. You don't want to have different thicknesses along this strip of wood. It's going to not glue up too well. You want a nice flat edge, or flat side to flat side fit whenever possible when you're gluing two pieces of wood together. And you want to plug in your saw before you try to turn it on. First piece. I like to do one strip off of each wood again to have a nice straight edge that I begin with, and so that these end up equal size. It makes them easier to clamp later on. Here's my two strips of wood. Put that up against your cross. Watch your wood grain. Go with the correct direction so it's nice and strong. I actually like that better. Trace your two lines. Make sure your pencil is right and tight against the tang. And you'll have that. And these will end up here and here. And you'll end up with this. Do a little check. What I like to feel here is that I'm going just slightly up. I can feel the lip just ever so slightly from my tang there. That way I know these are just a little thinner. That means they're not too fat, and it's going to be a loose fit. You know, if I need to, I can sand or file this down. Sand or file down inside here to make the root. There you go. I've got to match each of these pieces to the line. I'm going to apply glue to each side. That means to the wood and to the strip, you know, the thick piece in the strip. I'm going to clamp that sucker in place. I am not going to apply this top part yet. You don't do it all as one piece and try to clamp it together. These will shift on you too much. It's just not worth it. Take the time, let this lower half set up before you cap it, and move on to cutting off the excess wood and shaping it. You want a good amount of glue, but you don't want so much that it fills the inside of this. You're going to do your best to wipe away any excess down there anyway. But the less you end up with inside the cavity you're creating for the tang, the easier it is later on when you're trying to shape, or when you're trying to, you know, fit the handle onto the tang. That's your general idea. Now, time to clamp it down. Light pressure right now on this clamp. I'm not looking to tighten it up yet. Actually, what I like to do, let me see if I can catch this on the upside down camera here. If you can see how this is just overhanging here, I want to try not to do that because I'm going to be putting this piece back onto the tang for a good tight fit. I find it's the easiest way to do this half. And if this is overhanging and the tang's a little thicker, it doesn't like to fit too easily. So I'll back that off just to the edge. Good. As you can see, I've lost a bit of my line from the glue in there, so I'll get that back. Now, ultimately, it wouldn't really matter where you glued this down if you're just going to match it to the tang later on. But you're trying to, you know, keep everything straight lines for your grain, keep everything organized and in neat fashion because it'll make shaping it easier later on. That's pretty good right there. And you can see here, there is that angle that I spoke of right here, where it's not perfectly flush. This piece is not flush with this piece, but it's very minimal. You can make that out. Not gonna make a huge difference. Held down pretty good. Let's put the sword back in place. Fit right around the tang with it. Change this up. This is what I'm talking about doing. Chopping this right in. Gonna get right up and seeing how good is my fit, because I haven't done the clamps as tight as they can go yet. I can get everything really tight. I can see that it's right hard up against the cross here. It's hard to see my fingers in there, but hard up against the cross, and everything's tight to each other. Now I want to tighten these down a little bit at a time. That's it. That's what I got. I gotta let this set up now before I apply the top piece. And once it's set up, if I need to, I can clean any little bits of glue inside there that are giving me trouble. Nice way to tell if you've got a good tight fit. A little bit of glue ended up on my tang. That means they're all right and tight up against each other. Okay. See you in a while. Here's a little tip if you're finding it's hard to get the grip right up against the cross. Take your sword, hold the blade with a cloth to keep your fingers safe. Take a rubber mallet. And before these are tightened too much, just give it a couple taps. Press it right up so you've got a good tight hold between the cross, if you can see that inside here, the grip and the tang. Tighten that boy down. Once this has had time to set up enough that you can move around with it without risk of these strips coming out of place, we can go ahead and do the next piece, the top half I would call it. This guy here. There's always a slight curve to the grain of any wood. Use that to your advantage when you're fitting this. Easy way to know where you want to put the glue on this stuff is to line this up. And you know where you need to glue. And we're going to clamp it down. This is where it helps to have two of the same size pieces. It just makes it easier when you're lining it all up. I mean, ultimately, same deal. You've already set your shape to your tang, so let's go ahead and drop that on. And at this point, what I like to do is, again, come back to my sword tang and try fitting. So having your cloth handy to be able to grip the blade nice, tight, without having to worry about injury. It's an advantage. It's going to be a little difficult to see on the screen here. There I am, right up against everything. With the hint I gave before, if I needed to, I could tap that to a good tight fit. Tighten things down. And I might need to tap this thing off now as well. Or what I just skipped there was the rest of hammering this thing off the tang after testing the fit. I don't know, let's probably at it for another minute. But on tape, that'd be a long minute. I know I have a good tight fit now. Everything looks right on this guy. I continue to make sure these clamps are held down well. Now I do need to let this whole piece sit up for the full curing. So it's been a day drying. I've removed the clamps and I've put on some of the lines that I need to do to be able to create the basic shape. I didn't videotape myself putting those lines on because literally it's just me drawing lines, but you can see I've taken the SEPA here as a template, put it around here, measured it to even, trace that, put the two parallel lines here, do the same for the other side, two parallel lines, and then I carried each of those lines across the flat of each side. I'm going to cut these ends off and then take it over to the sander and start shaping. I want to use the bandsaw to cut this piece off, but before I can do that, since I've cut both ends off, I need to make lines now for the top coming around and across and the bottom. So I'm going to go do that and then do the bandsaw cuts. So you can see now I've got those lines across each new side. I can go ahead and start taken off some pieces here. I'm going to do it in stages. I'll continue to do that across both sides, and then I'll make a straight cut across it this way, having all those little pieces come off. So you can see I've taken off a lot of the meat there. Save me some time when I get to the sander. I can't stress enough how important it is to be careful when you're doing the sanding and the final shaping, to work slowly and meticulously. Move the piece little by little around all sides, everywhere as you go. Don't try to come down to your final width or thickness on either end too soon, or else you're going to end up taking off too much wood. You just want to bring it down to shape, little by little, evenly on all sides. Off first, sort of round it out all around, and then begin shaping the flat, like the curve into it this way, and this way, a little bit that way, and it taking it down to its basic shape. I prefer to use the disc. Just takes off stuff a lot faster, and it's okay there. Even the fact that I only have can only work about half of it at a time, sort of lends itself to the shape that I want to begin with, because I like to give it a bit of a swell in the center anyway. So I'm pressing in, I'm creating that more downward angle on each corner. I'm going to take the corners off, give it its general shape using the disc, and then I'll move up to the belt to actually finish it off. For reference, here I am basically matching the shape of the SEPA, and I'll start bringing it down to its final shape on the belt now. You can see I've still got a lot of room to remove. I guess it go that way, but you can get the basic idea there. Still a lot to take off. Another tip for determining your final size: make sure you don't make it too small. Take your pommel, put it to your grip, and do a tracing of that. Get yourself an idea of your final size, what it needs to be flush with your pommel. Repeat the same for your cross. Same idea. I can trace above and below the cross there. I can even put the grip on the sword and do those tracings while on the sword. Quick midway shot. Getting close now. You can see I'm coming close to it on each end, and you can see the basic shape is starting to find itself. Compared to a finished one, it's got the right shape that I want. It's just too thick all around. So I just continually take it down. And we're down to finished size here, apart from maybe just a little bit of hand sanding to... Oh, it's pretty smooth to begin with, but looks good. So, test fit on the tang now and see how it looks on the sword. Looks pretty good. I see that I might want to just narrow it a little more up here. Maybe just a touch more here as well. All in all, symmetrical. Feels great in my hand. Looks alright. Probably just take this down with a bit of a curve, just by hand sanding at this point. I don't want to mess around with the power sander and take off too much at the last bit. Just sort of slope it in so it matches up to the cross and pommel nicely. And then it's on to cord wrapping underneath the final leather wrap.